For many years we were taught that American soldiers were savages, men who loved killing and found pleasure in the torture of prisoners. That's what we believed, until the day I, a prisoner myself, saw everything I'd been taught begin to fall apart. Normandy, France, July 1944. The war was roaring across Europe like a storm that refused to end. Above the green fields of Normandy, the sky trembled with the thunder of engines. Lieutenant Hans Keller, 23 years old, gripped the control stick of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, the pride of the Luftwaffe. His orders were simple: destroy the American base hidden among the hedgerows near St. Mère-Église. But in war nothing is ever simple. As the first light of morning broke through the clouds, Hans saw the flash of anti-aircraft fire. Tracers cut across the sky, drawing fiery lines through the mist. He banked hard left trying to climb, but a shell tore into his wing. The cockpit filled with smoke and fire. Alarm screamed. He pulled the ejection handle, felt the violent rush of air, and then nothing but silence. The world turned upside down. His parachute snapped open, jerking his body in midair. Below him, the Normandy countryside stretched out like a patchwork of greens and golds, scarred by the black lines of smoke from the fighting below. He hit the ground hard, rolling through mud and grass, his legs searing with pain. The smell of burning oil lingered behind him. His plane, his pride, his war, all up in flames. Hans crawled toward a stand of trees, dragging his wounded leg. His sidearm was gone. His radio was broken. He pressed himself against the roots of an oak tree, heart pounding so loud he feared it would give him away. He'd been told what happened to captured pilots, that Americans didn't take prisoners, that they finished the job. He believed it. Every rumor, every whisper of American cruelty, it all came flooding back. Hours passed. The forest grew quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. A fly buzzed over his wound. He tore a piece of his undershirt, tied it tight, and prayed for darkness to fall. Then he heard it, voices. English. 2, maybe 3 men moving closer. He tried to lift his pistol, but his hands were shaking too hard. The voices came closer. Boots crunched over leaves. A shadow fell across his face. Then a shout, "We got one. He's alive." Hans froze. He waited for the gunshot that would end it all. Instead, one of the Americans knelt beside him. A hand pressed firmly against his bleeding thigh. "Easy, pal. You're gonna be okay." Hans didn't understand the words, but he knew the tone: calm, steady, human. The soldier tore open a medical pack, wrapped gauze around the wound, tightened it with a practiced pull. The other soldier watched, rifle still ready, but his eyes were not filled with hate. They were young, tired, just like him. In that moment, Hans realized he wasn't facing monsters. He was facing men. They lifted him onto a stretcher. The taller one offered him a canteen. "Water?" he said. Hans hesitated, then drank. The taste was cold, metallic, real. For the first time in days, it wasn't the taste of fear. As they carried him toward the road, Hans turned his head and saw the American patch on the medic's shoulder, a white star on olive green. That same star he had been taught to fear since he first wore a uniform. Now it was the emblem of the man keeping him alive. He wanted to speak, to ask why. But the words never came. Only a look, between enemies who, for one fragile second, forgot the war. Above them the sky cleared. The sound of gunfire faded behind the hills. In its place there was only breathing. 3 men, once enemies, now bound by something older than war itself. The simple, stubborn act of mercy. And so began the story of Hans Keller, the German pilot who fell from the sky and was saved by the very enemy he was sent to destroy. If you believe in stories that remind us of humanity even in war, subscribe and stay with us through this journey. When the American medic lifted Hans Keller onto the truck, the forest fell silent again. But the silence of Normandy in July 1944 was never the silence of peace. It was the kind that hummed beneath the air, trembling with the ghosts of engines, Messerschmitts, Mustangs, Spitfires, all clawing for the same sky, the same thin blue strip where young men went to kill and be killed. Each one carried a flag on his sleeve, and each one believed his side was the righteous one. Years before Hans fell through the clouds, another battle had already been fought, not over France but inside men's heads. In Germany, the voice of Joseph Goebbels poured through every radio, every newspaper, every cinema reel. He painted the Americans as savages, crude, bloodthirsty invaders who mutilated prisoners and called it justice. He told mothers that their sons would be butchered if captured, and he told soldiers that mercy was betrayal. For a young pilot like Hans, raised in classrooms where the Führer's portrait watched every lesson, such stories were not questioned. They were truth. He had never met an American, but he already hated one. Across the ocean, the story was told in reverse. In training camps from Texas to Norfolk, American recruits watched government reels that showed German soldiers as cold, mechanical killers, Nazi robots, the narrator called them, men who obeyed without soul or thought. Pamphlets warned, never trust a surrendering German. They'll fake it. They'll shoot you in the back. To hesitate was to die. To feel was to fail your brothers. And so, by the time the two armies met over the hedgerows of Normandy, they were not meeting men. They were meeting monsters of their own imagination. The irony was perfect. Each side believed the same lie, that mercy had no place in war. At the Allied airfield near St. Mary-Glise, the air smelled of gasoline, sweat, and mud. Men slept in tents patched with canvas, shaved using helmets filled with rainwater, and drank coffee that tasted like smoke. When the sun went down, someone always turned on a radio, letting Benny Goodman's trumpet drift through the dark like a reminder that the world still had music. They laughed when they could, cursed when they had to, and stared at photographs of women who might not wait forever. Most of them were barely 20. They looked like farmhands, mechanics, boys who'd grown up too fast. For all the orders and slogans, their war had become simple. Stay alive, get home. The grand speeches about freedom and destiny were for politicians. Out here, under the wet canvas and the thunder of artillery, the only philosophy left was human exhaustion. And somewhere in that exhaustion, mercy found room to breathe. Camp logs from the summer of '44 show American medics treating hundreds of German prisoners. Not because the Geneva Convention told them to, though it did, but because, when you've seen enough blood, you stop caring about which uniform it comes from. You just stop the bleeding. Sergeant Miller, the man who found Hans in the woods, never told anyone about that day. He was not the kind of man who kept diaries or spoke in sermons. If anyone asked, he probably said, "Just doing my job." But the truth was quieter than that. He had looked at the wounded German and for a second seen someone's son. And that was enough. Hans didn't understand the words the Americans spoke around him, but he understood tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't cruelty. It was weariness, the kind that makes enemies sound like reflections of yourself. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, he caught a glimpse of the medic's patch, a white star on olive green. The same star he'd been taught to fear since boyhood. Now it was the mark of the man keeping him alive. Outside, the world kept burning. Bombers roared toward the horizon. Villages crumbled. And yet, inside that tent, war paused for a heartbeat. Two enemies breathing under the same roof, divided by language but connected by something older than any flag. The simple instinct not to let another human die. As night settled over Normandy, the sky turned from smoke gray to velvet black. The gunfire faded beyond the hills. The moon hung low, pale and indifferent, casting light on both sides of the front without choosing either. It watched over American foxholes and German trenches alike. Men on both sides looked up from their beds, from their mud, from their fear, and for a fleeting moment they shared the same sky. Hans lay awake on a cot, his leg burning, his mind drifting through fragments of everything he'd been told. The American medic outside hummed softly, the same tune that had played on the camp radio. Something jazzy, something strange. It didn't sound like the enemy. It sounded like life. And Hans realized, in a way too small for words, that the line between right and wrong had always been thinner than the wing of his plane. Somewhere out there, above the clouds, other men were still fighting, German, American, British, all killing under the same stars. But those stars did not care for propaganda or flags or speeches. They only shone, cold and constant, over the madness below. If war was meant to divide men, the sky seemed to quietly disagree. It stretched above everyone, infinite and shared, reminding them, if they ever looked up long enough, that they were never truly separate. They were just two halves of the same world, breaking in different directions. And so, while the armies pushed forward, while orders were shouted and maps redrawn, one small truth survived in the dark, that mercy, even whispered in the middle of war, was louder than any bomb. The next morning, when Hans Keller opened his eyes, he saw sunlight bleeding through the tent cloth. The same light fell on the medic's hands as he packed his field kit. No speeches were made. No thanks exchanged. But something had shifted, something no uniform could explain. Hans was no longer the man who fell from the sky. He was the man who'd been saved by the enemy. And in the quiet between breaths, he wondered if that made him a traitor to everything he'd believed, or simply finally human. Before he was a prisoner in a tent outside Normandy, Hans Keller had been a boy in Leipzig. A boy who loved the smell of oil paint and rain on cobblestones. He once dreamed of becoming a painter. Not a soldier, not a hero, just someone who could make color out of gray. But the gray had come for him first. Germany in the 1930s was a place where childhood ended early. Posters lined the streets with faces of eagles and soldiers, a flag stretched wide like wings. In school, teachers spoke less about art and more about destiny. The word fatherland was written in every textbook, capitalized like the name of a god. And for a boy like Hans, impressionable and eager to belong, the promise of flight was irresistible. The Luftwaffe was new, glamorous, and proud. Its pilots were called Knights of the Air. They were told they didn't just fight for Germany, they were Germany. His father, a railway worker who'd lost a leg in the last war, didn't understand it. He had seen enough of flags and glory. He would sit by the window, smoking cheap tobacco, and mutter that wars only make widows. But his voice carried no power in Hitler's Germany. The posters were louder. The marches were brighter. And when the recruiter came to their town in 1941, Hans was 17, and the sky was calling his name. He left home with a sketchbook in his bag and his mother's cross sewn into his sleeve. At flight school in Merseburg, the romance of flight died fast. The instructors didn't speak of clouds or dreams, they spoke of precision, obedience, and death. Every morning began before dawn, drills so cold that frost grew on their breath. They were taught to feel the machine as part of themselves, to know the engine's heartbeat, the wings tremble in wind. But they were also taught something else, that mercy was weakness, that hesitation cost lives, that pity belonged to the defeated. Hans wasn't built for cruelty. He was quiet, thoughtful, the kind of young man who played piano when no one watched. At night, while others boasted about future victories, he drew faces of his comrades, the curve of a propeller, the way sunlight struck a hangar window. He never showed anyone. He just drew as if trying to remember a world where things were still beautiful. When he earned his wings in 1943, his instructor clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You fly like a poet, Keller. Try not to die like one." Hans laughed, but the words stayed with him. Because poets, he knew, never killed anyone. By the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe was dying faster than it could train new men. The Allied bombers came by the hundreds, darkening the sky over Hamburg, Berlin, Dresden. Hans flew missions he barely understood, scramble orders, interception patrols, desperate defense of cities already lost. He learned to watch the horizon for glints of silver, the American P-51 Mustangs that ruled the air now. He had friends who went up and never came back, their names scratched from the duty board by lunchtime. The war was supposed to be glory. Instead, it was math, a simple equation of fuel, altitude, and survival. One day in May, his squadron was ordered to escort a bomber group over France. The target was said to be a strategic military position. That phrase always sounded clean, professional, righteous. But when Hans saw the target through the smoke, a cluster of houses, a church steeple, women running across a field, the word strategic burned away. He saw a farm, a place that looked too much like home. The bombs fell anyway. The ground erupted in white flashes, and for a moment he thought he saw a figure in the courtyard below, carrying a child. He flew higher, away from the smoke, and felt something crack quietly inside him. That night, in the mess hall, his comrades celebrated a successful operation. Hans sat at the end of the table, staring at the soup cooling in his bowl. He could still smell the fire. He could still hear the siren from the village below. He wanted to believe that war had rules, that they were the good ones. But something in his chest told him that maybe everyone believed that, and that was why no one ever stopped. When he returned to Merseburg, he wrote his mother a letter he never sent. He told her the sky wasn't what he thought it would be, that it was colder, lonelier, full of things falling. He signed it "Your son still flying," and tore it up before mailing. Censorship, after all, was everywhere. And even if it weren't, how do you tell your mother that her son no longer believes in victory? In July 1944, the order came for another mission. A low-altitude raid on an American supply depot near Normandy, a bold strike meant to disrupt Allied reinforcements after D-Day. Hans didn't ask questions. He just checked his plane, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 that had seen better days, patched wings and a half-broken compass. He touched the metal like one might touch an old friend. Then he climbed into the cockpit, sealed the canopy and waited for the engine's cough to steady into a roar. They took off before dawn, 10 planes slicing through the fog. Hans led the third flight, altitude 6,000 feet. Below, the French countryside unrolled like a patchwork quilt, rivers, farms, thin roads leading nowhere. The radio crackled with static and clipped commands. Then came the flash of tracers, the scream of anti-aircraft guns. The first bomber in formation vanished in a bloom of orange. Another spiraled into the trees. Hans dove low, feeling the world tilt beneath him, heart hammering faster than the propeller. He saw the American base ahead, trucks, tents, fuel tanks, and lined up his sights. For a second, everything narrowed to a single point. Duty. Target. Fire. He pressed the trigger. The machine gun spat flame. Then a burst of light hit his left wing and the cockpit filled with smoke. Alarms wailed. The stick jerked hard. The ground rushed upward. Hans pulled, screamed, prayed. The sky shattered around him. When he opened his eyes again, he was on the forest floor, half buried in leaves, blood soaking his flight suit. Somewhere his plane burned itself into the dirt. He lay there listening to the distant thunder of war, realizing that for the first time, he wasn't above it. He was inside it. That was how the Americans found him. Not as a knight of the air, not as an enemy ace, just a broken man clinging to life. And as he stared up at the medic who knelt beside him, Hans thought of all the things he'd been taught. That the enemy was cruel. That mercy was weakness. That a good soldier never begged. But when the American pressed a bandage against his wound, and said something he couldn't understand in the gentlest voice he'd ever heard, Hans realized the hardest lesson of all. Everything he believed had been wrong. He flew for his country but not always for its cause. And now, for the first time, he was falling not through the clouds, but through his own illusions. The man who once dreamed of painting the world now lay still, watching the sunlight flicker through the leaves, as if God himself were trying to paint him back into something human. They carried him on a stretcher through the dripping woods, boots squelching in the mud, rifles slung loosely at their sides. The Americans didn't speak much. Hans tried to read their faces, cold, blank, unreadable, and his mind filled in the silence with every horror story he had ever been told. He had heard that captured pilots were sometimes shot on sight, their bodies left for scavengers. He had heard that Americans cut off ears as trophies, that they smiled while doing it. Back in Germany, his instructors had sworn that no one taken by the enemy ever came home alive. The forest path wound upward. Hans could smell gasoline, smoke, and the faint scent of coffee. The sky had begun to fade into orange as the men brought him through a narrow clearing, where tents rose in uneven rows and vehicles rumbled in the distance. He realized, with a shock that made his chest tighten, this was the American base he had tried to destroy. A sergeant pointed toward a medical tent. They laid him down on a wooden table under canvas walls stained with dirt and blood. A fan hummed lazily somewhere overhead. Hans waited for the blow that would end him. Instead, he heard a calm voice, "Easy there, buddy. You'll be all right." It came from a young medic, barely older than Hans himself. His uniform was dusty, his sleeves rolled up, a red cross patch stitched to his arm. He spoke with a soft Midwestern accent, the kind Hans had never heard before, full of vowels that sounded like open fields. Hans flinched when the medic touched his leg, but the man only said, "Shrapnel, huh? Lucky it missed the artery." Then he smiled, a quick human smile that didn't belong to war. The medic worked carefully, cleaning the wound with antiseptic that stung like fire. When Hans gritted his teeth, the man nodded as if to say, "I know." He didn't ask questions, didn't mock, didn't strike. When it was done, he offered Hans a canteen. Water. Hans hesitated. He half expected poison. But thirst won. The water was cold and clean. Then something strange happened. The medic reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a cigarette. "Smoke?" he said, tapping it lightly. Hans stared. He hadn't had a cigarette in days. The smell of tobacco filled the tent. The medic lit two, handed one across the table, and for the first time since falling from the sky, Hans found himself breathing like a man again, not an animal waiting for slaughter. He didn't understand the words that followed, small jokes, short phrases, laughter from the men outside, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't hatred. It was exhaustion. Humanity, frayed but still alive. Later they gave him food, real food. Not the dry bread or thin soup of rations, but a tin plate with stewed carrots and something rich and warm that made his throat ache when he swallowed. Someone handed him a small glass bottle. He turned it over curiously, reading the label. Coca-Cola? The taste was strange, sweet and sharp at once, bubbling against his tongue. It didn't taste like war. It tasted like another world, one he had never been told existed. He ate slowly, every bite a quiet act of disbelief. These men, these supposed monsters, were feeding him better than his own officers ever had. That night, he lay on a cot inside the same tent where his wound had been treated. The medic, whose name he finally caught as Paul, came by to check the bandage. He spoke slowly, gesturing to make Hans understand. "Tomorrow, transport," he said, drawing a little square in the air, "the camp." Hans nodded. When Paul turned to leave, Hans whispered the only English word he knew that seemed right, "Danke." Paul paused at the flap of the tent, looked back and gave a small nod. "You're welcome, Fritz," he said, half grinning, not cruelly, just playfully. Then he disappeared into the dark. Hans didn't sleep much. His body ached, but his mind burned brighter. Every story he had believed, every rumor of American cruelty, of their thirst for revenge, had begun to unravel. He thought of his comrades who'd sworn to fight to the last bullet, who'd rather die than fall into enemy hands. He thought of the officers who'd said Americans were animals in uniform. Yet here he was, bandaged by one, fed by another, alive because of them. He couldn't make sense of it. By morning the camp was already buzzing. Trucks loaded with supplies, soldiers shouting across the field, radio static crackling with codes. Somewhere, a gramophone played swing music, brassy, bright, the rhythm of a country that somehow seemed untouched by despair. Hans was carried to a truck marked POW. There were other Germans inside, mostly young, dazed, gray with fatigue. They glanced at him but didn't speak. None of them knew what awaited them. The truck rolled slowly through the muddy road. American guards sat with rifles across their knees, watching but not menacing. One of them hummed a tune, something bluesy, while another whittled a piece of wood with his knife. Hans watched, puzzled. This was not how conquerors looked. They were boys just like him, wearing a different badge. After an hour, they arrived at a fenced area surrounded by barbed wire, the temporary prisoner camp. Inside were dozens of tents, a few makeshift kitchens, a line of latrines. Nothing looked like the torture chambers his instructors had described. When they helped him off the truck, he limped to the gate, expecting guards to shout, to push, to humiliate. Instead, a corporal simply pointed him to a tent and said, "You'll get medical rounds at 12. Mess hall's that way." Hans didn't know what mess hall meant, but the smell of food led him there. Inside he saw a strange sight, American soldiers eating beside prisoners. Not together, but near enough that voices mingled, laughter drifted. An older German, his face wrinkled beneath a bandage, whispered, "They treat us like people. Unbelievable." Hans sat with his tin plate again, listening. Two American soldiers at the next table were talking about home. A farm in Iowa, a wife in Tennessee, a baby born while the father was away. They didn't speak with triumph. They spoke like men who wanted to go home more than they wanted to win. He caught one of them saying, "My boy's turning 2 next month. I just hope he remembers my face." That sentence hit Hans harder than any bullet. He remembered his own father, the old railway worker with one leg, sitting by the window, warning him what war truly was. He remembered not listening. And now, across enemy lines, he was hearing the same truth, spoken in another language but with the same ache. The days that followed blurred together. The Americans followed routines, medical checks, food, roll calls. The guards didn't shout, they gave orders plainly, even respectfully. Hans found himself studying them, their gestures, their easy laughter, their strange politeness even in control. One afternoon, the medic Paul came by again, carrying a small brown notebook. He sat by Hans's cot, pointed at a few doodles Hans had been sketching, crude drawings of the camp, the trucks, the men. Paul grinned. "Artist, huh?" Hans blushed, not understanding all the words but catching the tone. Paul took a pencil from his pocket and handed it over. "Here, keep it." Beats staring at the ceiling. Hans took it, fingers trembling slightly. He wanted to speak, to ask why. Why show kindness to someone who had tried to kill you? But he couldn't form the words. So he just nodded again, muttering, Danke? That night he drew until his hand ached. Not airplanes or uniforms, but faces. The medic's grin. The soldier smoking outside the tent. The young guard who whistled while he walked. He drew them because they confused him, because they didn't fit the world he'd been taught to hate. He began to realize that propaganda was like fog, thick, choking, and only real until the sun rose. Now, under this new light, everything looked different. There was one moment that sealed it. Late one evening as the camp settled, rain began to fall. The guards ran for cover. Hans stood by the flap of his tent, watching the drops blur the world outside. Across the field he saw Paul again helping another wounded prisoner. When he was done, Paul lit 2 cigarettes, offered one to the German, and the 2 men sat under the same canvas, smoke curling upward like a fragile truce between heavens. Hans watched until the cigarettes burned to ash. He whispered to himself in German, feigned? No. Menschen. Enemies? No, humans. He had once believed that victory meant destroying the enemy. Now he wasn't sure victory meant anything at all. The next morning, when an officer came to question him about Luftwaffe positions, Hans answered honestly, not out of betrayal but out of clarity. The war that had consumed his life no longer made sense. The men who had saved him weren't his enemies. The lies that shaped his youth had finally broken. He was still a prisoner, behind wire, under watch, marked as enemy combatant. But inside, something had shifted, something freer than flight. He no longer feared his captors. He feared only the moment he might have to return to a world where mercy was weakness again. Because here, among strangers who had every reason to hate him, he had found something that the Reich had promised but never delivered: decency. He was their enemy. Yet that night they shared their cigarettes under the same tent. And for Hans Keller, the man who once fought to defend a lie, that small ordinary mercy became the most powerful truth he would ever know. The mornings at the prisoner camp grew quieter as the days stretched on. The sound of gunfire in the distance had dulled to a low thunder, like a storm too far away to matter. For the first time since he had joined the Luftwaffe, Hans Keller woke not to the roar of engines, but to the murmurs of men talking, laughing, sharing stories he barely understood. The Americans were different. They carried themselves with an odd ease even in war. They worked hard, swore plenty, joked even more. Yet beneath all that there was a kind of order, not the rigid, breathless discipline of the Reich, but something simpler, rooted in belief rather than fear. They called it the Code. Hans didn't know that name at first. He only learned it one morning when Paul, the medic, came to check his stitches. Paul noticed the small tattoo on Hans's wrist, an eagle clutching a swastika, and said softly, "That mark doesn't scare us, you know. You're a prisoner, sure. But a man's a man." Hans frowned, trying to piece the English words together. "Man? Man?" he repeated. Paul nodded, then tapped his chest. "Same here. We treat you right. That's the Code." The Code. It was something drilled into every American soldier from the day they enlisted. The Geneva Convention. Signed in 1929, revised through blood and tragedy, it said that prisoners of war were to be treated humanely, given food, medical care, dignity. No matter what they had done. No matter whose insignia they wore. In the Reich, mercy was seen as weakness. Compassion was for the conquered. But here, in this muddy camp somewhere in Normandy, Hans began to realize that to the Americans, mercy was proof of victory, not over men, but over the brutality that war demanded. He watched them work every day. They built new tents for the wounded. They brought water from the nearby stream, filtered it through canvas, handed it to prisoners before drinking themselves. When rations ran low, they divided everything evenly, no special privilege for the uniformed conqueror. One afternoon, Hans saw a guard break his last piece of chocolate in half and hand it to a captured German boy who couldn't have been more than 17. The boy's hands trembled as he took it. The guard only smiled and said, "Don't thank me, kid. Thank the Red Cross." That night, Hans lay awake thinking about that small square of chocolate. In Germany, chocolate was propaganda, reward for loyalty, fuel for soldiers, something you earned through obedience. Here it was just kindness in a wrapper. A few days later, the chaplain came. He arrived in a dusty jeep with a cross dangling from the rearview mirror and a calmness that felt almost unnatural amid the mud and noise. He was a tall man with tired eyes, wearing the same olive uniform as everyone else, but instead of a gun, he carried a small leather Bible. He gathered the soldiers and prisoners together near the mess tent. The Americans stood on one side, the Germans on the other, uncertain, wary. Hans stayed near the back, listening. The chaplain's voice was low, but it carried. "War teaches men to see each other as monsters," he began. "It tells us to hate so we can kill without guilt. But the truth is harder. The truth is that even the enemy is a son to some mother." A silence fell over the crowd. The words struck like something sacred, something too fragile for a battlefield. Hans looked down at his bandaged leg, remembering his own mother, the way she used to hum Still Nacht while cooking, the way her hands trembled when he left for flight school. For the first time in months, the memory didn't hurt. It simply was. The chaplain went on. "You may think mercy has no place here, that it makes you weak. But look around. You're alive because someone refused to become the thing war wanted them to be. Mercy isn't weakness, gentlemen. It's the only strength that survives when everything else is gone." When he finished, no one clapped. No one spoke. Even the guards seemed lost in thought. Hans felt something inside him loosen, a knot that had been tied too tight for too long. He understood only fragments of the speech, but the message was clear enough. These men weren't playing at morality. They believed it. The Americans kept proving it in quiet ways. Paul brought him a small notebook, filled with sketches of birds and planes drawn by other prisoners. "You draw?" he asked. Hans nodded. "Then add yours. Everyone leaves something here. Keeps us human." The notebook became Hans's sanctuary. Between the smudged pages, he sketched the camp, the trees, the curve of the guard tower against the sun. One evening he drew Paul's face, tired but kind. When Paul saw it, he laughed. "You made me look like a movie star," he said, shaking his head. "I'll take it." Days passed. Sometimes Red Cross trucks came through, bringing supplies. Medical kits, letters, blankets stamped with the emblem of a red cross on white cloth. Their presence seemed to change the air. Even the roughest soldiers straightened up when they arrived. The Red Cross delegates walked the camp politely, making notes, inspecting tents, checking that prisoners had food and shelter. They spoke to Hans through an interpreter, asked if he had been mistreated, if he was receiving medicine. He told the truth. "They treat me well. Better than I expected." One of them smiled, jotting something in her ledger. "That's good to hear," she said. "Mercy must be consistent or it isn't mercy at all." He never forgot that line. At night, he heard the guards playing cards, laughing, listening to the radio. Once, a voice crackled through the static, announcing that Paris might soon be liberated. The Americans cheered. The prisoners stayed silent, pretending not to understand. But Hans did understand. He felt a strange mixture of loss and relief. The Reich that had demanded his loyalty was crumbling. Yet he didn't feel the shame his officers would have expected. Only a quiet gratitude that maybe when this was over the world could start over too. Then came Christmas. Snow fell over the camp in thin, reluctant flakes. The air turned sharp, the kind that makes breath visible. The guards built a small fire near the mess tent, hung a few scraps of tinsel someone had salvaged from a supply crate. Someone even painted a wooden star and nailed it to the top of a crate labeled Ammo .30 cal. That evening, the chaplain gathered everyone again. He said a short prayer, not for victory but for peace. Then one of the soldiers, a man with a voice like gravel, began to sing softly. "Silent night, holy night." Hans froze. He knew that melody. He had sung it every Christmas of his life in German, Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht. And then, without thinking, he began to sing too. His voice joined the Americans, hesitant at first, then clearer. Around him, other German prisoners followed, the words blending in two languages but one emotion. "Alles schlaft, einsam wacht. All is calm, all is bright." The sound floated over the camp like something fragile and eternal. The guards didn't stop them. They listened. Some even joined in. For a few brief minutes, there was no war, no enemy lines, just a choir of exhausted men who had seen too much and still somehow remembered how to hope. When the last note faded, no one moved. The chaplain wiped his eyes. Paul handed Hans a small piece of chocolate and said quietly, "Merry Christmas, Fritz." Hans didn't know the words, but he understood the feeling. He smiled and whispered, "Frohe Weihnachten." And Paul somehow understood too. That night, Hans didn't dream of burning planes or falling skies. He dreamed of home. Not the Germany that banners and speeches had built, but the real one, the smell of bread, the warmth of his mother's kitchen, the hum of peace. He realized then that the Americans' greatest weapon wasn't their guns or their planes. It was their belief that even in the darkest moment humanity could still be chosen. That mercy, not hatred, could be the mark of victory. As he drifted to sleep under the hum of generators and distant thunder, Hans thought, if this is defeat, perhaps I was fighting for the wrong side all along. The morning after Christmas, the camp stirred earlier than usual. Frost covered the ground, turning the muddy paths pale and brittle under the boots of guards. The war had not stopped for Christmas. It never did, but something in the men had changed. The laughter was quieter now, the movements gentler. Even the guards spoke in lower tones, as if afraid to disturb whatever fragile peace had settled overnight. Hans was called from his tent just after dawn. 2 guards escorted him to the command post, a wooden shack that smelled of coffee and oil. Inside sat an American officer with silver bars on his collar. He introduced himself as Captain Warren. "Lieutenant Keller, right?" Warren asked, flipping through a folder. His voice carried no hostility. "We'll need to talk about your unit. Just routine. Nothing to worry about." Hans nodded, nervous. He had expected this. Interrogation was inevitable, but the tone puzzled him. No shouting. No slamming fists on tables. Just questions asked like conversation. "Where were you based before Normandy?" Merseburg," Hans answered carefully. "Long flight," Warren said, scribbling notes. "You guys sure knew how to make a Messerschmitt dance." Hans blinked, unsure if that was praise or mockery. Warren smiled faintly, perhaps sensing the confusion. "Relax, Lieutenant. We're not here to hang you. We just want to end this war faster. You can help with that." The words "not here to hang you" lingered in Hans's mind like an echo. He remembered the stories they had been told in Germany, tales of Americans skinning prisoners alive, of camps where men vanished. Yet believed them. Everyone had. Yet here he was, sitting in a warm room being offered coffee by the very enemy who had shot him down. When the questioning ended, Warren stood and extended his hand. Hans hesitated, then took it. The American's grip was firm but not cruel. "You did your duty," Warren said. "Same as any of us. Let's both hope our countries learn from this mess." Outside, Hans felt the winter air bite at his face. For the first time, he wondered if maybe the true difference between nations wasn't power, but principle. Days turned into weeks. The war raged on beyond the fences, but inside the camp, time had its own rhythm. Trucks came and went. Prisoners were transferred deeper into France or across the Channel. Every few days, American doctors visited, treating wounds, handing out aspirin and quinine. One evening, Hans helped carry another injured German, a pilot from Bremen, to the infirmary. His arm was shattered, his face burned. Paul, the medic, worked late into the night sewing the wound. When Hans offered to fetch water, Paul nodded. "You're good at this," he said. "Maybe you should have been a doctor instead of a pilot." Hans gave a small smile. "Maybe war changed many things." "Yeah," Paul said quietly. "It changes everything, except what's right." That line stuck with Hans for days. He started watching the Americans more closely. The way they looked after each other. The way they spoke about home, not as glory or conquest but as a place they wanted to get back to. One soldier showed him a photo of his wife and newborn daughter. "Haven't even met her yet," the man said, grinning sadly. "Guess I'll owe her a few birthdays when this is over." Hans nodded, unable to find words. For the first time he realized the enemy also had dreams, not of domination or empire but of small, ordinary things. Then came the Red Cross inspection again. This time Hans volunteered to translate for new prisoners. It was his way of giving something back. He saw how carefully the Americans followed the inspector's notes, building better latrines, distributing blankets evenly, making sure even the sickest prisoner had food. It wasn't perfect, nothing in war ever was, but it was honest. One afternoon, as the Red Cross van left, Captain Warren gathered the guards and spoke quietly. Hans caught only part of it. "We don't win this war by killing better. We win it by staying who we are." Those words became a quiet anthem in Hans's head. Spring came slowly. The snow melted into mud again, and rumors spread that the Allies were pushing east, that Berlin itself was in flames. The prisoners gathered near the fences at dusk, listening to the distant booms and wondering what home would look like now. When victory finally came, it arrived not with cheers but with silence. An American sergeant walked through the camp holding a telegram. "The war's over," he said simply. Hitler's gone. No one spoke for a long time. Some of the prisoners wept. Others just stared at the ground. Hans felt nothing at first. Then, slowly, a weight lifted, not triumph, not relief, but something deeper. The feeling of waking from a long, violent dream. That evening, Paul found him near the fence. "Looks like you'll be going home soon," he said. Hans looked past the wire at the sunset spilling gold over the tents. "Home?" he repeated softly. "Yes, if home still exists." Paul handed him one last cigarette. "You'll rebuild it," he said. "You guys always do." Hans took a drag, exhaling the smoke into the cool air. "Maybe," he said. "But I think I'll build it differently." In the weeks that followed, many prisoners were released. Some boarded trains bound for Germany. Others, like Hans, hesitated. He had no desire to return to a land haunted by ghosts and rubble. When the Americans asked if he wished to be transferred to a POW facility in the United States, he said yes. And so, one morning he boarded a transport truck heading to Le Havre. As it rumbled down the dirt road, he turned to see the camp fading in the distance. The guard towers, the tents, the men who had become, in some strange way, his teachers. He thought of Paul, of Captain Warren, of the chaplain's words, "Even the enemy is a son to some mother." That night, as the ship crossed the Atlantic, Hans stood on deck, feeling the wind whip across his face. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had guided him through combat, the same ones that now marked a journey not of conquest but of renewal. He realized that what the Americans had shown him was not just mercy, it was freedom. The kind that came not from winning wars, but from refusing to let hate define you. In his heart, he whispered the words he would carry for the rest of his life. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was the American way. Spring turned to summer, and by the time the Red Cross vans stopped coming, Hans could already walk without the limp that had shadowed him since the crash. His wounds had knitted into pale scars, and though his body healed, his thoughts often drifted elsewhere, to the men who had tended to him, to the strange gentleness that had somehow survived amid so much ruin. He began helping around the infirmary, carrying supplies, washing bandages, passing water to the fevered. The nurses teased him for his accent. The doctors appreciated his discipline. He learned to say, "I got it," and "hang on, buddy," in a clipped American way that made them laugh. The guards had long stopped calling him Kraut. Now it was Hans. That small change, a name instead of a label, meant more than he could explain. Among those he worked with most was Private Sam Turner, a boy from Kansas with sandy hair and an easy grin. Sam was only 20, barely a man, but already he carried the weight of too many winters. His older brother had died in Italy. His father ran a farm. Sam talked about them often, always ending with the same sentence. "After this, I'm going home. Gonna fix the barn, marry my girl, and never wear boots again." Sometimes, when the day ended and the horizon burned orange, they'd sit by the fence, trading broken words, Hans in clumsy English, Sam in slower ones. "You flew planes?" Sam would ask. "Yes," Hans nodded. "Fighter pilot. Messerschmitt Bf 109. "Damn," Sam whistled. "Guess that makes you dangerous." Hans smiled faintly. "Not anymore." The friendship was quiet, built on small kindnesses. An extra biscuit from the mess hall, a pack of cigarettes slipped through the wire, a joke shared even when neither fully understood it. Then came the news, a list of names pinned to the board outside the command hut. Transfers. Hans's name was there. Camp Hearn, Texas. He stared at the word for a long time. Texas, a place he'd only seen in maps, a land that sounded more like a myth than reality. He was told it was safe, warmer, and far from the front. But leaving meant saying goodbye to the faces that had, against all odds, become familiar. That night, Sam found him sitting alone near the fence. "You're heading west, huh?" Sam said quietly. "Yes," Hans replied. "They say it is far." "Far's one word for it," Sam smiled. "You'll like it there. Big sky, hot sun. Better coffee too." Hans nodded but said nothing. There were no words that could hold what he felt. Later, in the dim light of the barracks, he took a piece of paper from the infirmary desk and began to write. The pencil trembled in his hand. His English was broken, uncertain, but his thoughts were clear. To Private Samuel Turner. "When I was shot down, I thought I would die. When I woke up, I thought you would hate me. You did not. You treated me like a man, not a prisoner. You gave me food when I was weak, you spoke to me when others would not. I do not forget that. You said one day the war will end. I hope when it ends, men will remember that kindness is stronger than hate. You taught me this. If I ever see the sky again, I will think of you. Your friend, Hans Keller. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully like something sacred. The next morning he handed it to a Red Cross officer who promised to pass it through censors. Hans knew every letter was read before it left the camp, but he didn't care. Let them read it. Let someone, anyone, see that mercy had lived here. On his final day the prisoners lined up to board the trucks. Sam stood among the guards, helmet tucked under his arm, eyes red. He held out his hand. Hans took it firmly. Take care, Hans, Sam said. Write if you can. They'll let mail through even from Texas. Hans tried to answer but his throat tightened. Finally he managed, I will. And you, go home. Fix your barn. Sam laughed, a small cracked sound. You remembered. The truck engine started, coughing smoke. As it rolled forward, Hans leaned out the back, raising his hand. Sam lifted his in return, a blur against the morning sun. For a long while neither looked away. That image, the American soldier waving goodbye through dust, stayed with Hans through the long train ride, through the ship's crossing, through the endless fields of America that stretched like another planet. Texas was hot and flat, the camp surrounded by barbed wire and cacti instead of snow and pine. But the routine was familiar. Roll call, rations, work details. Some guards were kinder than others, but none cruel. At night, Hans would lie awake listening to the cicadas and think of Sam's voice, of Kansas skies and Christmas songs, of how strange it was that he had found his humanity in the heart of his enemy's land. Weeks later a parcel arrived. Inside was a photo, two men standing in front of a wooden barn, one young, one older, both smiling. On the back, written in careful print, "The barn's fixed." The girl said yes. "Hope you're flying again somewhere peaceful. Sam." Hans held the photo for a long time. Then, slowly he smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need a flag or a uniform or even a country to exist. He didn't write back as a soldier. He wrote back as a man who had found humanity in war. News traveled slowly in the prisoner camps, carried in whispers, scribbled notes, and quiet conversations over shared bread. But when a story like Hans Keller's spread, it moved faster than the winds over the Texas plains. Men who had known nothing but suspicion and fear began to tell each other what had happened in Normandy, how a young German pilot had been shot down, wounded, and then cared for by the very soldiers he had once sought to kill. At first, many prisoners doubted it. It seemed impossible that the enemy could act with such decency. They had been taught to expect cruelty. They had been trained to survive it. Yet the story persisted, repeated by those who had seen it firsthand. Bandages applied gently, food shared freely, cigarettes offered without expectation, a hand extended where only a gun had been imagined. In the mess tents and sleeping quarters of Camp Hearn, a quiet transformation began. Conversations shifted from anger to wonder. Prisoners spoke of Americans not as faceless executioners, but as men capable of compassion, capable of choices that defied ideology. It was not propaganda. It was proof. Proof that even in war humanity could endure. Hans's letter to Private Sam Turner became part of that growing legend. Copies were read aloud in the barracks, folded and passed from one bunk to another. Men who had spent months counting the hours in despair now felt a glimmer of hope. One prisoner wrote to his mother in Hamburg, describing not the suffering but the kindness he had witnessed. Another kept a small sketch of Paul, the medic, as a reminder that honor and empathy were possible even behind barbed wire. Even the camp commander, Colonel Thompson, noted the change. He had seen countless men arrive bitter, hardened by fear and loss. But as he walked through the camp one morning, he overheard a group of prisoners laughing quietly while sharing a crate of oranges. He paused, hands on hips, and smiled. "We fight the war," he said to his officers later, "but we don't fight humanity." The words were simple but they carried weight. They became a quiet credo repeated by officers and soldiers alike. Mercy, Thompson knew, did not weaken discipline, it strengthened it. It reminded both captors and captives that the war was temporary, but character endured. Red Cross reports from 1945 reflected the same lesson. Inspectors documented adequate food, clean water, medical care, and humane treatment of POWs across American camps. Yet beyond statistics and checklists, the impact was personal. Prisoners who had once viewed Americans as monsters were seeing men, fathers, brothers, human beings who could choose empathy over brutality. Years later, long after the war had ended, one of those American soldiers received a letter in the mail. The envelope was worn, the ink slightly faded. Inside was a simple message from a former German prisoner. "You saved my life, and in doing so you changed it. I will never forget your mercy." The soldier folded the note, holding it to his chest. Memories of Normandy, of the cold, the smoke, and the distant explosions came flooding back. He remembered the bandages, the food, the quiet voice that said, "You are a man, not an enemy." Sometimes he would say, "The softest act leaves the loudest echo." For Hans Keller and countless others, the echo resonated far beyond the barbed wire. It influenced how they spoke to their fellow men, how they viewed the enemy, how they chose to carry themselves when the uniform was gone and only memory remained. The kindness that had been shown to him in a small, muddy camp in Texas became a lesson that transcended borders, a story whispered across generations, that even when nations clash, humanity can prevail. And in that enduring truth, the war's darkest shadows were softened, not by victory or power, but by a single simple act of compassion. In the summer of 1946, the long nightmare finally ended. The war that had reshaped the world, torn families apart, and sent millions to their deaths was over. Prisoners of war were being repatriated, loaded onto trains and ships to return to homelands scarred by conflict. For many, the thought of returning to Germany brought relief, a sense of homecoming after years of uncertainty. Hans Keller, however, felt no such relief. Germany, the land that had birthed him and demanded his loyalty, felt foreign now. He remembered the smoke, the hunger, the propaganda, and the blind obedience demanded in the name of a nation that had lost its moral compass. The streets of his hometown, once familiar, were a ruin of shattered walls and broken hearts. The symbols of authority that had guided him were now hollow. When an American officer offered him the chance to return to Germany with the other prisoners, Hans hesitated. He thought of Sam Turner, of Paul the medic, of the chaplain, of the countless soldiers who had chosen mercy over vengeance. He thought of the small camp in Texas where men had shared food, laughter, and humanity with the very people they had been trained to kill. "In America," he finally said, his voice quiet but resolute, "I found something my country lost, humanity." And so Hans chose to remain. The decision astonished some officers, confused others, but Hans's mind was made. He would stay in a land that had treated him as a man, not a prisoner, and build a life from the fragments of a world torn apart. He settled in Ohio, a state of rolling hills and industrious towns, and began working as a machinist. The machines reminded him of the planes he had flown, precise, mechanical, yet alive with purpose. He married, had children, and slowly wove himself into a community that had once been entirely foreign. The scars of war never fully healed, but they faded in the warmth of ordinary days. Morning coffee, the laughter of his children, the smell of bread baking in the oven. In time, Hans became a quiet advocate for reconciliation. He spoke to local schools about the war, the importance of seeing beyond propaganda, and the power of simple acts of kindness. His story, a soldier once enemy, now neighbor, reminded those who heard it that home is not always where you were born. Sometimes home is where mercy found you. Looking back on those years, it becomes clear that the story of Hans Keller is not just a tale of one man's survival, but a testament to the principles that define the American way. In war, it is easy to become consumed by violence, suspicion, and hatred. Yet even amid chaos, the choices we make, small gestures, moments of patience, acts of mercy, can echo far beyond the battlefield. The Americans who saved Hans did more than follow orders. They lived by a code that honored the dignity of every human being, even those deemed enemy. The chaplain who spoke of sons and mothers, the medic who tended wounds without question, the soldiers who shared food and cigarettes. They demonstrated that compassion is strength, not weakness. Through Hans's eyes, the world learned a lesson that no bullet or bombing could teach, that mercy is the true measure of power. Even as nations clashed, the humanity of individuals endured. The acts of kindness Hans received rippled outward, affecting countless others in ways that statistics could never capture. And so, the story closes with a reflection. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. It is what sustains society, preserves honor, and defines a nation not by the wars it fights, but by the way it treats those it could destroy. If you found this story moving, consider subscribing to the channel, There are countless tales of courage, humanity, and unexpected grace waiting to be shared. Hans Keller lived the rest of his life in the United States, far from the ruins of his childhood. He never returned to Germany, and he never forgot the hands that had saved him, the voices that had spoken gently, the songs that had reminded him of home in the middle of chaos. He became part of the community, a witness to history, a living bridge between nations once at war. When he passed away decades later, he was laid to rest under the American flag, in a small cemetery that honored former prisoners of war. The same wire fences and tents were long gone, replaced by quiet lawns and gravestones, each one marking a life that had survived conflict. Among them, Hans's grave stood as a testament to reconciliation. Those who had once called him enemy were now remembered simply as men who had chosen mercy over vengeance, humanity over cruelty. Visitors came to his grave, some curious, some seeking lessons from the past. They read the inscription, reflecting on a life transformed not by victories in battle, but by the choices made in moments of care and compassion. And in the quiet of that cemetery, surrounded by the wind and the whispering leaves, one thought remained: mercy. That's the word he chose to leave behind. He came as an enemy. He stayed as a man. He left as a reminder. For anyone watching, anyone listening, and anyone who wonders what it truly means to be humane, Hans Keller's life offers an answer. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how courage, compassion, and humanity can triumph even in the darkest hours of history.